May 12, 1945, 8:30 hours. Marktplatz, Aachen, Germany. 8-year-old Greta Schneider clutched her mother's hand, staring at the long line of people stretching across the rubble-strewn square. Hollow-eyed women holding emaciated children. Old men who could barely stand. Teenagers with legs wrapped in dirty bandages. All of them waiting, silent, terrified. 4 days ago, the war had ended. 4 days ago, German radio had announced surrender. 4 days ago, Greta's world had collapsed, not from bombs this time, but from the terrible knowledge that everything was lost, that the Reich was finished, that the Americans were coming. Her mother had hidden them in the cellar when American troops entered Aachen. "They will kill us," Mama had whispered. "Or worse. The Führer warned us what would happen if we lost." Greta had listened to those warnings her whole life. British and American soldiers were monsters who would massacre German civilians, enslave survivors, burn cities for pleasure. Better to die than face them. But hunger had driven them from the cellar. 3 weeks without proper food. The last bread gone 5 days ago. Greta's baby brother crying constantly from hunger her mother could no longer satisfy. So they'd emerged, expecting death, and found instead this line. At the front, American soldiers in olive uniforms were distributing food from the back of an army truck. Not at gunpoint, not as forced labor, just giving it away. To anyone. To everyone. "It's a trick," a woman behind them muttered. "They'll poison us, or make us slaves." But Greta watched a small boy ahead receive a can of something, clutching it like treasure. She watched an old woman accept a bag of flour, tears streaming down her face. She watched her mother's grip tighten on her hand as they shuffled forward, step by step, toward the Americans who were supposed to be demons but were handing out food like neighbors, like humans. When they reached the truck, a young GI with freckles looked down at Greta and smiled. He said something in English she didn't understand, then held out a chocolate bar. An entire bar. More chocolate than she'd seen in 2 years. He placed it in her hands, then gave her mother 3 cans, meat, beans, condensed milk, and a small bag of sugar. "Für das Baby," he said in terrible German, pointing at her baby brother. For the baby. Greta stared at the chocolate, at the soldier, at her mother's disbelieving face. The monster was smiling at her, giving her food, speaking broken German to make sure she understood it was for her starving brother. Her mother whispered, so quietly Greta almost missed it. Everything they told us was a lie. The hunger that came before. By spring 1945, Germany was starving. The Allied bombing campaign had systematically destroyed transportation infrastructure, making food distribution impossible even where supplies existed. Railway bridges lay in twisted metal heaps. Roads were cratered beyond use. Canals were blocked by sunken barges. The logistics system that had fed 70 million Germans had simply ceased to function. The Nazi government's final months had been chaos. Officials fled or committed suicide. Local authorities disappeared. The distribution networks for ration cards collapsed. Millions of civilians found themselves with worthless ration coupons and no food to buy, even if the coupons had been honored. The Wehrmacht's retreat through Western Germany had been scorched earth. Army units commandeered civilian food supplies as they fled eastward. What they couldn't carry, they sometimes destroyed to prevent American use. Farmers who tried to hide grain or livestock faced summary execution for sabotage. By the time American forces arrived, many towns had been stripped of food by their own retreating army. In cities, the situation was catastrophic. Urban populations, entirely dependent on food shipments from rural areas, faced immediate starvation when the distribution system failed. The bombing had destroyed warehouses and granaries. What stores remained were quickly exhausted. By May 1945, cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Aachen contained hundreds of thousands of civilians who hadn't eaten adequately in weeks. The numbers were brutal. Estimated civilian population facing severe malnutrition in Western Germany, 15 to 20 million. Daily caloric intake in cities, averaging 1,000 calories. Normal requirement, 2,500. Children under 5 suffering acute malnutrition, approximately 60%. Deaths from starvation and related disease, March-June 1945, estimated $150,000 to $200,000. Greta Schneider's family was typical. Her father had died in the Wehrmacht in 1944. Her older brother had been conscripted into the Volkssturm in March 1945 and never returned. Her mother, grandmother, baby brother, and herself survived in the cellar of their bombed house, eating progressively smaller portions until there was nothing left to ration. "We boiled grass and potato peels," Greta recalled in a 1989 interview. "We ate paper mixed with flour to feel full. My baby brother cried constantly, and my mother couldn't feed him because she was too malnourished to produce milk. We were dying slowly, and we knew it." The propaganda that failed Nazi propaganda had spent years conditioning Germans to fear occupation by Allied forces. Joseph Goebbels's propaganda machine had portrayed Americans and British as barbaric subhumans bent on destroying German civilization. Radio broadcasts described supposed Allied atrocities in occupied territories. Newspapers printed fabricated stories about mass executions of civilians. Posters showed American soldiers as apes with grotesque features. Children learned songs about defending the homeland against savage enemies. As defeat became inevitable during 1945, the propaganda intensified. The message was clear. Occupation would mean death, torture, enslavement. German women would be raped. German men would be executed or worked to death. German children would be taken away. Better to fight to the last man than face the horrors the Americans would inflict. "We truly believed it," said Friedrich Weber, who was 17 when the Americans reached his town of Würzburg. "We'd been told for years that Americans were monsters, that they'd exterminate us if we lost. When the fighting stopped, we expected mass executions. My mother made us all pray together because she was certain we'd be killed." This conditioning created genuine terror among civilian populations as American forces approached. Many Germans fled eastward, preferring Soviet occupation despite the reputation of Red Army troops. Others committed suicide. Individual families and sometimes entire communities choosing death over anticipated American atrocities. The propaganda's intensity reflected Nazi leadership's desperation. If civilians believed occupation meant certain death, they'd support continued resistance. Towns would fight. Citizens would resist. The collapse would be delayed. But the strategy contained fatal weakness. What happened when Americans arrived and didn't commit atrocities? The soldiers who brought food. American forces entering Germany in 1945 carried two contradictory mandates: defeat the Nazi regime completely, but treat civilian populations humanely. Military government officers received training in occupation procedures, emphasizing that German civilians, while collectively responsible for Nazi crimes, deserved basic humanitarian treatment. The policy was practical. Mass starvation would create disease, unrest, and reconstruction obstacles, but also reflected American values about civilized warfare and treatment of non-combatants. The logistics were staggering. The U.S. Army had to feed its own forces while simultaneously preventing humanitarian catastrophe among defeated enemy populations. The solution was systematic. Military government detachments would establish food distribution points in occupied towns, using army supplies until civilian infrastructure could be restored. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Personnel involved: over 12,000 civil affairs officers and support staff managing civilian relief. Initial food distribution: approximately 2,500 calories per civilian per day, compared to 801,000 they'd been receiving. Supply sources: U.S. Army rations, requisitioned German agricultural production, captured Wehrmacht stores. Reach: by June 1945, American forces were feeding approximately 7.2 million German civilians in occupied zones. The soldiers implementing this policy were often ambivalent. Many had seen concentration camps, witnessed Nazi atrocities, lost friends to German weapons. Now they were ordered to feed the enemy's children. Some resented it. Others understood the strategic necessity. Many discovered that feeding starving children was harder to resist than orders demanded. Private James Kowalski, 3rd Armored Division, described his first food distribution. "We rolled into this town, I forget the name, and people were living in bombed buildings, skinny as hell, kids with distended bellies from malnutrition. Captain ordered us to set up a food line. I was angry about it. These people supported Hitler, but then I saw this little girl, maybe 6 years old, who looked like a skeleton. When I handed her a can of beans, she started crying. How do you stay angry at that?" Aachen. The first feeding Aachen, captured in October 1944, became the first German city where Americans established systematic civilian feeding operations. The city's population had dropped from 165,000 pre-war to approximately 20,000 civilians hiding in cellars when American forces entered. Most buildings were damaged or destroyed. Utilities had failed. The civilian administration had collapsed. The population was on the edge of starvation. Military government officers established distribution points where civilians could receive army rations. The program began small, a few hundred people per day, but expanded rapidly as civilians emerged from hiding and refugees flooded in from surrounding areas. Corporal Thomas Henderson ran one of the first distribution points. "We set up in what used to be a school. People were terrified to approach at first. They'd peek around corners, watching us unload crates of food. We had to use megaphones to announce that anyone could come get rations. No questions asked, no punishment." Eventually, hunger overcame fear. The first day we fed maybe 50 people. Within a week, it was over 1,000 daily. The distribution followed systematic procedures. Civilians registered with military government offices. Each family received ration cards based on size. Distribution occurred at designated times and locations. Rations included canned meat, beans, vegetables, flour, sugar, powdered milk, coffee. Special allocations for children under 5, condensed milk, vitamins, chocolate. The response from German civilians was shock, followed by gradual acceptance that Americans weren't going to commit atrocities. The food distribution became evidence contradicting years of propaganda. "They gave us real food," recalled Anna Schmidt, who was 14 in Aachen in 1945. "Not scraps, not leftovers, the same rations American soldiers ate." My mother kept saying, "This can't be real. They're fattening us for something terrible." But days passed, then weeks, and the terrible thing never came. Just food. Regular food distribution. We started to understand we weren't going to be killed. Frankfurt. The scale of mercy. When American forces captured Frankfurt in March 1945, they inherited a city of 400,000 civilians facing immediate starvation. The city's food stores were exhausted. The transportation system was destroyed. The Nazi administrative structure had collapsed. Without intervention, Mass starvation was inevitable within weeks. The U.S. Army's response was logistically sophisticated and morally straightforward. Establish emergency feeding operations using military resources until civilian infrastructure could be restored. The numbers revealed the scale. Military government personnel deployed, 127 officers and 430 enlisted men managing civilian relief. Distribution points established, 43 locations across the city. Daily rations distributed, approximately 340,000 by June 1945. Tonnage of food moved, averaging 120 tons daily from April through July. Kitchen facilities, 17 mobile field kitchens serving hot meals to those unable to cook. Major Robert Harrison commanded civilian relief operations. The logistics were harder than supporting combat operations. We had to identify every civilian, establish fair distribution, prevent black market diversion, and do it all while the city was still being cleared of die-hard SS units. But the alternative was watching hundreds of thousands of people starve. That wasn't acceptable. The food distribution in Frankfurt demonstrated systematic American commitment to preventing humanitarian catastrophe among defeated enemy populations. This wasn't sporadic charity. It was organized relief on a massive scale, sustained for months, treating German civilians as humans requiring assistance rather than enemies deserving punishment. For Frankfurt's civilians, the experience was transformative. Maria Koch, who was 23 in 1945, described it. "We'd been told Americans would starve us deliberately. Instead, they organized the most efficient food distribution I'd ever seen. Better than anything the Nazi government had managed during the war. They saved our lives, and they did it systematically, professionally, like our survival mattered to them." The mother's recognition. German women, especially mothers, were often the first to recognize that American behavior contradicted Nazi propaganda. Mothers confronting their children's starvation had to make immediate practical decisions about survival. Ideology became irrelevant when children were dying. When Americans offered food, mothers took it. When the food proved safe and the distribution continued, mothers spread the word. The Americans weren't monsters. Elizabeth Hartmann, mother of 3 in Cologne, described her transformation. "I'd believed what we were told, that Americans would kill us or worse. But my children were starving. When I heard Americans were distributing food, I had to try. I expected humiliation, maybe punishment. Instead, the American soldier at the distribution point gave me rations for my whole family, extra milk for my baby, and smiled while doing it. I went home crying because I realized everything I'd believed was propaganda." This pattern repeated across occupied Germany. Mothers comparing their expectations, atrocity, with reality, food, became agents of psychological change, telling neighbors, friends, and family that Americans were feeding Germans despite having every reason not to. The practical mercy spoke louder than words. Children were being saved by enemy soldiers. Families were surviving on American rations. The evidence was undeniable and present in every home. The canned goods, the flour, the condensed milk that kept babies alive. "My mother had been a party member," recalled Gerhard Klein, whose family lived in Mannheim. "She'd believed in Hitler until the end, but when Americans gave us food, gave it freely, without forcing us to do anything, without punishing us, she sat at our table, looked at the American rations and said, 'We were lied to about everything.' That was the moment she stopped being a Nazi." The old men's shame for older Germans who'd lived through World War I, American behavior created painful comparisons with Nazi propaganda's promises. These men had experienced Germany's humiliation in 1918, the hyperinflation of the 1920s, the Depression. Many had supported Hitler because he'd promised to restore German dignity and prevent another defeat's humiliation. Now, facing that defeat, they discovered the predicted American atrocities weren't happening. Instead, the enemy was feeding them. Hans Weber, who'd been a Wehrmacht veteran in World War I and was 62 when the Americans arrived in 1945, described his reaction. "I'd believed the Führer when he said the Americans would destroy us if we lost. I'd supported the war because I thought we were fighting for survival. Then Americans entered our town, and instead of revenge, they brought food. I'd sent my son to die in this war. He died fighting Americans. Now, Americans were keeping my grandchildren alive. I felt ashamed. Ashamed that I'd believed the lies. Ashamed that we'd committed atrocities while claiming we were defending civilization. Ashamed that the enemy showed more humanity than we had." This generational shame, older Germans confronting the gap between Nazi propaganda and American reality, created some of the deepest psychological impacts of occupation. These were people who'd actively supported the regime, who'd believed its justifications, who'd sacrificed their children to the war. Discovering that the enemy was merciful, while their own government had been monstrous, destroyed self-conceptions built over decades. The food distribution became evidence in an unwanted trial where Germans judged themselves. American soldiers didn't need to deliver lectures about Nazi crimes. The simple act of feeding enemy civilians did more to demonstrate moral superiority than any propaganda could achieve. Berlin, the ultimate symbol. When American forces reached Berlin in July 1945, they found a city in absolute ruin and a population facing imminent starvation. The Soviet occupation had been brutal. Looting was systematic. Rape was endemic. Food distribution was chaotic when it occurred at all. German civilians had experienced exactly the occupation terror Nazi propaganda had predicted, except it came from the Soviets, not the Americans. When American forces took over their sector of Berlin, the contrast was immediate. American military government established systematic food distribution, restored utilities where possible, prevented looting by American troops, and treated civilians with professional distance rather than cruelty. The food distribution in Berlin was particularly significant because civilians could directly compare American and Soviet occupation. The comparison favored Americans overwhelmingly. Lieutenant Colonel James Bradford commanded American military government in Berlin's Zehlendorf district. "We fed about 200,000 civilians in our sector. The conditions were apocalyptic. Rubble everywhere, no infrastructure, people living in basements. But we established distribution points, maintained schedules, ensured fair allocation. The German civilians couldn't believe it. Many told us they'd expected American occupation to be like the Soviet occupation. Instead, we ran it like a civic service program." For Berliners, the American feeding program became the foundation for post-war attitudes toward the United States. The memory of Americans providing food while Soviets seized it influenced Cold War loyalties for generations. Ingrid Becker, who was 19 in Berlin in 1945, later wrote, "The Soviets took everything and gave nothing. The Americans gave us food, treated us fairly, didn't rape or loot. For years, we'd been told Americans were the real enemy. In Berlin, we learned who actually cared about German survival." The cognitive break for Germans who'd supported the Nazi regime. American behavior created psychological crises that shattered ideological frameworks. The propaganda had been so absolute, Americans as subhuman enemies who would exterminate Germans, that its complete falsification through direct experience forced wholesale reevaluation of everything the regime had claimed. If Americans weren't monsters, what else was false? If enemy soldiers showed mercy, what did that say about German soldiers' behavior? If the people you'd been taught were inhuman showed more humanity than your own government, what did that mean about your participation in Nazi crimes? Werner Braun, who'd been a Hitler youth leader and was 17 in 1945, described his psychological collapse. Everything I'd believed, everything I'd been taught, everything I'd based my identity on, it was all revealed as lies when Americans gave us food instead of bullets. I'd been ready to die for the Führer. I'd believed we were superior, and they were beasts. Then a black American soldier, someone our propaganda said was subhuman, gave my sister chocolate and helped my grandmother carry water. I couldn't process it. My entire worldview just broke. I spent months not knowing what to believe anymore. This cognitive dissonance was widespread among Germans, especially younger ones who'd been most thoroughly indoctrinated. The food distribution became the evidence that forced confrontation with Nazi propaganda's falsity, which opened questions about everything else the regime had claimed. For many Germans, this psychological break was the true beginning of denazification, not through Allied re-education programs, but through the undeniable evidence that they'd been fundamentally deceived about their enemy's nature. The final count. By the end of 1945, the American occupation's feeding program had prevented the humanitarian catastrophe Nazi leadership had hoped would follow defeat. The statistics demonstrated systematic mercy at massive scale. German civilians fed by American forces. May-December 1945, approximately $7.8 million. Total tonnage of food distributed, over 450,000 tons. Daily caloric distribution per civilian, averaging 1,050 calories compared to 1,000 pre-occupation. Estimated lives saved from starvation, $200,000, $350,000. Child mortality reduction, declined 40% in American zones by end of 1945. These weren't propaganda numbers. They were logistical achievements, documenting that American forces had systematically fed millions of enemy civilians through months of occupation, preventing starvation despite having every moral justification to let natural consequences unfold. The contrast with Soviet occupation zones was stark. In Soviet-controlled areas, food distribution remained chaotic, looting continued, and civilian suffering persisted. In American zones, systematic feeding operations meant German civilians were surviving and beginning recovery. For Germans comparing occupation experiences, the lesson was clear. American occupation meant survival and eventual reconstruction. Soviet occupation meant continued suffering and exploitation. This comparison shaped Cold War alignments throughout divided Germany.